Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for June the 27th, 2021. Hope you're doing well on this day. So we've got Deuteronomy 32, the famous Song of Moses. Then we have Psalm 119, verse 121 through 144. And then we have Isaiah 59, and then finally Matthew chapter 7. So let's dive right into our text. So we'll start with Deuteronomy 32 once again. And again, this is, as I described yesterday, this is the death story of Moses. And what we have in Deuteronomy 32 technically is called a covenant witness. An aid is what it's called in Hebrew. And this would be a song that would be sung in later generations to remind the people of the words of Moses and the warnings of the Lord through Moses. And it would serve as a prophetic witness, a way in which the people in later generations would be drawn back into proper covenant relationship with God through remembering this song. The song begins, if you look at it, as Moses describes how the nations came forth after Noah. He gave the nations their inheritance, verse 8. He separated the sons of men. But then the Israelites fell into the idolatry after God chose them, graciously chose them out of all the nations of the earth. Israel, as it says in verse 15, grew fat and kicked and had grown fat and thick and sleek, and he forsook the God who made them and scorned the rock of his salvation and made him jealous with strange gods. But what will God ultimately do? Well, he will, after he punishes them, and this is, it talks about some of the covenant curses here in the text. Ultimately, because of the fact that he is a God that is unique, verse 39, no God besides him, no God like him, he will ultimately avenge the blood of his servants and take vengeance on his adversaries and atone for the land and for his people. So it's kind of the story of Israel in one song, and yet it would be a reminder, I think, as you go through the rest of the Old Testament of God's faithfulness to His word, and it would have been a reminder for those subsequent generations of what God would do in response to their covenant infidelity, but also in response to the returning to Him. And then Moses finishes speaking all those words, gives some final exhortations at the end of the chapter. Moving on to Psalm 119. So in Psalm 119 we have, let's see, starting in verse 21, I believe, and going through Psalm 119, verse 44. One of the things that, obviously, this is a psalm that we've talked about, celebrates the word of God in just about every single verse. Now, you will find in this particular section in verses, I think 121, 122, and then once again in verse 132, we actually have several of the few verses in Psalm 119 that don't refer to the word of God in some way, with some synonym for the word of God or for the Torah, but the majority of them do. And here's a challenge for you as you read through. This is something I've done in my text. As you read through, write out the characteristic of the word of God that is celebrated or esteemed or praised in the margins. So what is the characteristic of the word of God, which of course is representative of God himself, that the author is celebrating? So for instance, verse 127, it talks about them. He loves the commandments above gold, yes, above fine gold. So the commandments, the word of God is desirable. Verse 128, they are right. Verse 129, they are wonderful. Verse 130, they are enlightening. Verse 140, they are pure. Verse 142, they are true. And so that, I think it's a helpful thing to kind of meditate on the character of the word of God. And of course, one of the things that we see in the scriptures is that the things that are associated with God in this case, like his word, but of also his name, but also his people, are to reflect his character. And so the word of God here is just reflective of God's own character as being right and true and pure and desirable. So Psalm 119. Moving on to to Isaiah 59. So in Isaiah 59, we have some warnings once again, on the part of God to his people. We have some Isaiah explaining how God's people are going to sink to new lows, basically. It's funny in verse 1 of chapter 59 that God's hand is not so short that he cannot save, nor his ear so dull that he cannot hear. I remember in verse, I can't remember exactly what verse, but in chapter 6, Isaiah is told to go to a people who have ears that but cannot hear and eyes that cannot see. But God is not like that, right? He is separate from his people, and their iniquities, verse 2, have made an increased separation between God and his people. And so the human sin in the people of God, but also in just humanity as a whole, is so radical that only God can bring about salvation. And yet God has promised that there would be salvation, a redeemer, one who will buy Israel back from their enslavement to sin, will come to Zion, and to those who turn from transgression in Jacob, declares the Lord. So there's this promise of restoration that we find in this text as well in Isaiah 60. And that brings us to Matthew 7. So this is completing the Sermon on the Mount. And it, to me, as I read through this, it seems really similar to, again, to some of what we find even in Deuteronomy. I think the first part of this, remember that chapter 6 was dealing with some of the attitudes of those who were in the New Covenant community. And remember what the Sermon on the Mount is, that Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is on a mountain because he is showing himself to be this new Moses, this new covenant mediator. He is forming a new covenant community of faith and showing a new way, which is really getting to the heart of the old way, what it should have been for the Israelites. But under Jesus, it is now possible, this new covenant relationship with God. And what are the characteristics of that new covenant community? Well, chapter 6 talked about some of the attitudes, and we also see some of those attitudes continue on in the first part of chapter 7 here, talking about how you should have an attitude that is not hypocritical, an attitude that sees your own sin and own unrighteousness for what it is, an attitude that that is one that is aware of false prophets, even. And we'll talk about that more in a minute here. An attitude that goes to the Father for that which we need. First and foremost, an attitude of humility in that sense. And then in verse 12, he kind of summarizes the totality of at least the horizontal relationships within the New Covenant community by kind of reiterating what we find in the Torah. Treat people the same way you want them to treat you, the golden rule here, right? For this is the law and the prophets. So here's Jesus summarizing and really getting to the heart of what is the law and the prophets, or what is the covenant relationship, this new covenant relationship, what it should look like. Well, this is how we should treat people, the way we would want to be treated ourselves. Then at the end here, he gives some final warnings, I think, as he kind of summarizes this new Torah, I guess you could say, in the part of Jesus, for this new covenant community of faith. He warns, for instance, that there are those who are going away from this teaching, who are not following in righteousness, who are not following their new covenant mediator, Jesus Christ. They are going on the broad way, but that way goes to destruction, Jesus says, but instead enter through the narrow way. Well, where's the narrow way? The narrow way is following this path that has been outlined in Matthew 5 through 6. And there are a few who find it. And the only way through that is Jesus himself, as he states in John 14:6. He also warns us against false prophets who come to us in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. But of course, that ultimately points us to look for the true prophet, Jesus himself. And then finally, he exhorts us to base our life, as Psalm 119 has exhorted, in this new covenant, this new word of God, the words of Jesus, and this will be the foundation that'll be like a rock for our life. And he finishes these words, and they are amazed that he is teaching them as one having authority and not as one of the scribes. In other words, he's kind of like Moses, might have been saying, but of course he is even greater than Moses, giving this new covenant way of life in Matthew 5 through 7. So I think that's all I wanted to say on this wonderful passage. I mean, we could obviously spend so much more time on much of what we find here in this rich text. We could spend literally years preaching through, I think, Matthew 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount. But I hope this has been an encouragement to you on this day, June the 27th, 2021. I hope you have a great rest of the day.